Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Tellier-Coto. I'm a professor in the history department. I work on Southeast Asia, and I'm the current director of the Southeast Asia program at Cornell. We have quite a full room, and apparently there's quite a number of people online as well. So hopefully all the tech is working so that folks can hear everything today. I want to welcome everybody to the 13th Frank Golay Memorial Lecture. This is held once every few years at Cornell, and this is the highest honor given by Cornell's Southeast Asia program. There's been many past luminaries coming through giving talks for the Golay Lecture. The last one was given by Dr. Brenda Yeo of the National University of Singapore. And this lecture has a history going back decades in the Southeast Asia program. So it's always exciting to do this. We get to invite someone that we'd really like to hear, often from far away, and this year is no exception. So this year, it's really my pleasure to introduce Ashley Thompson, who's the Hiram Woodward Chair of Southeast Asian Art at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And she's the author of a number of important books, and I'm just gonna talk about each one very quickly. So Angkor, a manual for the past, present, and the future, which she did together with Ang Chalun and Eric Prenowitz. Dance in Cambodia, which she did together with Tony Shapiro. Calling the Souls, a Khmer ritual text, which came out in 2005. And more recently, Engendering the Buddhist State, Territory, Sovereignty, and Sexual Difference in the Invention of Angkor. So I encourage you to go and read all of those. If you have a little time left, she's also written quite a lot in terms of edited volumes, and a lot of these are important and very well cited. I want to just talk about two of them. That's one of the first of these was Early Theravadan Cambodia, Perspectives from the History of Art and Archaeology. And another one is the Rutledge Handbook of Theravada Buddhism, which she did with Stephen Berkowitz. She also has something that's coming out in just a few weeks that she would really like people to have a chance to read. It's a special issue of the journal Art History, which is on pre-modern Southeast Asian art and decoloniality, which is, again, just coming out in a few weeks from now. So please do keep an eye out for that. So without any further ado, I want to just introduce Ashley Thompson, and maybe we can give her a warm welcome to Ithaca.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you to the Cornell Southeast Asia program. It's really lovely to be back here and to find a lot of friends and colleagues and students and people who I haven't seen in a while and people who I've been looking forward to meeting as well. So really lovely to be here. I also wanted to thank my colleagues elsewhere, all of those people who have worked with me or without me in and on around restitution in Southeast Asia. I have a few shout outs in the talk, but standing behind those shout outs are a number of other people who are also very much behind the facts and the thoughts that I will share with you all today. So there is a revealing episode in the Buddha's life story, one that, like many others, is about the revelation that the vision of the Buddha entails. So there's a kind of double vision, a vision that enables another vision, though the flip side of such a structure is that there's some obscurity in any vision. But this episode or sequence is also about the dubious virtue of replication, the revelatory power of return, and at the same time, something else altogether, or so it seems, certain techniques for consolidating sovereignty and expanding territorial dominion. I'm referring to what transpires after the so-called miracles at Savatthi, where the Buddha has beaten off rivals by proving his special powers to shoot water and fire from his body aloft in the sky, illuminating the cosmos for the gathered crowds, and producing multiples of this brilliant self that, and this is the part that I like the most, engage with each other, though perhaps I should say engage with themselves in a kind of cosmic Q&A session, as if rational debate and over-the-top supernatural WWE-style performance somehow complement each other. As you might expect, The Buddha then travels to the heavens to offer teachings to his mother. You can see on the top here where he's offering teachings to his mother in this image of Tabatimsha. Meanwhile, in his absence, the Buddha is missed dearly down on earth. Some traditions have it that during his time away, a replica was made of him, the first Buddha statue, to soothe a world-bound king unable to bear life without the Buddha. It's interesting to me that this first statue is presented more like a lover's keepsake or memento than a testamentary effigy. The absence which the statue palliates is the temporary absence of a living being whose return one awaits and one anticipates. As with all mementos, it's not clear whether this statue serves as a substitute presence in the absence of its model or a present reminder of the original's absence. Of course, the question of the return and of the Buddha's return in particular is a major theme in Buddhist thought, with its cycles of the samsara and indeed the many returns of the Buddha himself or himself other as the various bodhisattvas or Buddhas themselves. So this distinction between the statue as a funerary marker in memory of someone who is really and truly dead and the statue as a temporary stand-in or substitute for an absent but returning loved one may miss the point. In much Buddhist thought, there is neither absolute absence nor, for that matter, full presence, as we'll see in a minute. In any case, the question of the return, and remember that I'm thinking in the direction of restitution, is not a simple one. But in his absence, the Buddha is entreated to return and is supplied for this purpose with a red ruby ladder, flanked by a gold and silver ladder, one on each side for his entourage. As beings, human and otherwise, watch expectantly, the progress of the brilliant body down the rungs reveals the cosmos again. All of space and time is there for all to see, the human realm opening onto heaven and hells at once. This is the bottom part of the image of Tabatimsha that you can see on your screen here. This fleeting revelation is interesting not only because it treats time and space equally as equivalent challenges to vision, but in that it involves an accentuated mode of vision, as if all the people in an apartment block could suddenly see each other through walls and floors. And above all, because this supervision depends on the becoming transparent, which is to say invisible, of barriers that, paradoxically, were not seen as such until they are removed. In other words, one generally sees positively the world one inhabits. One of the oddities of this revelation, as the Buddha trumps his doubters, we might say, while descending this cosmic escalator, is that such normal vision is revealed indeed to be a kind of blindness. This cosmic vision of the cosmos lasts only while the Buddha is in the process of descending back to earth. We might say obviating with his return, his renewed presence, the need for representations or substitutes, statues, or images. This suggests that we might understand the ephemeral and paradoxical omnivision as a kind of proof or explication of the function of the statue. Absence is not absence. You may not be able to see the Buddha when he is in heaven, but he is still present. And furthermore, this suggests a way of seeing the statue as if it were in some sense a remainder or anticipation of this cosmic vision, as if it were a kind of portal beyond the immediate reality in which it appears to exist, as if when looking at the statue, one were in fact seeing cosmically through all the mundane barriers to the Buddha himself. Indeed, the manner of representing the Buddha's progress in this scene has drawn the attention of art historians for its notable non-naturalism. Unlike the figures flanking him, the Buddha is not shown flexing his knees or making any other bodily movement indicating descent. He descends like a statue, appearing frontally, standing atop a lotus pedestal as if propelled floating from rung to rung. This is really an astonishing thing. The Buddha is replaced in his absence on earth by a statue, but then when he does finally, iconically, return, he returns in some sense as himself a statue. I like to think here of Judith Butler's characterization of gender as an imitation without an original. And of course, they are adamant that it's not just that the original is missing or absent, there is no such thing. Or rather, the impression that there is an original is in fact an illusion produced by the performativity of the performance, of this imitation that's not the imitation of any original. Be careful what you wish for, this story seems to say, as if the king's impatience to replace the absent Buddha with a present statue had the effect of turning the present Buddha as well into a statue. And yet there's no reason not to interpret this the other way around, as in fact revealing a deep truth about the Buddha himself in the flesh, and by extension about anyone at all. That is, that the self is an illusion, that we would do better to think of ourselves in some sense as statues, and as statues without originals. Because of course, if there's something dead about a statue, there's also something very alive about the secondary firstness, if I can put it that way, of the imitation without an original, this quite miraculous performativity that in some sense engenders something out of nothing. But the becoming statue of the returning Buddha plays out in other ways as well. The cosmic vision is only fleeting, and the Buddha's return bolsters a certain socio-political order organized around the dissemination of the image, his image, in person as it were, through his peregrinations and in statuary and other visual forms. In fact, the indistinction between the two, the Buddha and his image, is a point of conceptual elaboration comprising core elements of what is broadly called Buddhism today. And this has practical consequences in the quite diverse practices of fabrication, consecration, veneration, and visualization that serve to ensure the image is alive, the incarnation in the here and now of a lineage of great men, mirroring, modeling, and monitoring leaders, and otherwise intimately incorporated into, often literally incorporating, the lives of common devotees. So in today's lecture, I will contemplate restitution in Southeast Asia today in the light of, or perhaps the shadow of the story, and with an anxious eye on our times. Questions that will haunt the talk, whether or not I address them explicitly, and many I will not address explicitly. Nonetheless, these questions that haunt me in speaking about this include: what affects does absence evoke and how? What expectations arise in the spectacular progress of return, on whose part and why? What transformations take place in the comings and goings or not? How, when, and where? Why and how do these processes constitute identifications at shifting scales, from the individual to the communal, to the national, to the regional, to the international, to the global, to the cosmic, at once closing down histories and borders and carrying the potentials for visionary unification? Do they reproduce Hindu-Buddhist hegemonies, made as much in the Sanskrit-Pali cosmopolis as in colonial knowledge production? Is the statue irrevocably, etymologically, a stand-in for the stable state, long ago but enduringly rendered by the Sanskrit stapana, recording the erection of statuary across much of Southeast Asia and communicating across centuries with today's English language states? Are we witnessing the reconsolidation of the commercial wing of an ever-expanding global conglomerate, surveying borders between subject and object, in a supremely well-disguised reconsolidation cum neo-expansion of post-Enlightenment Western metaphysics embodied now in the Southeast Asian National Museum? Or are we catching glimpses of another time and space, past, present, and future, where animism wins the day, as Achille Mbembe has suggested, not without irony, with respect to African and other indigenous restitution contexts? With restitution here or there and everywhere, are we all animists investing at long last in the mutual agency of objects and their people? And what does that matter in the long run if the magic stone is the locus of identity linking man and territory morphed into the Shaivite linga, or if the kris has held its own as another phallic form, extending that of the men who hold them physically and metaphysically, as together they make powerful lineages? And last but not least, as these last examples, which herald the restitution cases I will summarize shortly, suggest, what does gender have to do with it? So I'll turn now to a few more larger-than-life stories that might be read through the prism of the Tavatimsa episode of the Buddha's life story that I've just summarized. On the one hand, the return of and as a statue in a performative affirmation of sovereignty that offers a vision of the human realm, its heavens and its hells. And on the other hand, the questions that the story evokes for me around the problematic of restitution. My first story is one of triangulating relations between Cambodia, Thailand, and the United States. It's a story of post-colonial looting and contemporary restitution, decolonial or not, I am unsure, but certainly involving neocoloniality. It's a story arising from multiple histories, beginning with Angkor and traversing the post-Angkorian period and the growth of what would become Thailand. The story is thoroughly inflected also by the colonial period, which I argue, of course, with many others, applies not only to Cambodia in this case, but also to colonial period Siam, whose monarchy and elite came to identify with European colonial powers in their archaeological, carnosaurial, conservation, and art historical practices. This was also the period when borders between mainland Southeast Asian states were drawn, yet the story is above all one of the 20th century, indelibly marked by the establishment of independent states across the region, quickly followed by the US war in Vietnam and its aftermaths. This is a period whose conflicts worked also to usher in the American market for Khmer art under the direction of traffickers, as well as the political and connoisseurial sway of figures like John D. Rockefeller, whose archives are just a stone's throw from here. And it is a story that certainly does not end today, affecting still many people in Southeast Asia and beyond. My second story is likewise one of triangulating relations, but here between Jakarta, the Netherlands, and a desolate Balinese king. It's a story of colonial looting and contemporary restitution, again, decolonial or not, I'm unsure, but also certainly involving neocoloniality. It too arises from multiple histories dividing and uniting neighboring polities and peoples that would together one day be called Indonesia, colonial histories of different colors where Java might be subjugated but always remain supreme, and where successive acts of armed resistance against the Dutch continue to shape the politics of restitution. But first, a word about words. I've used the words colonial, decolonial, and neocolonial, and I've twice expressed some hesitation or uncertainty about their definitions or about the lines that separate them, either in the so-called semantic field or in the real historical political one. Needless to say, I won't have been the first, but one of my aims here is to problematize in some measure to deconstruct these borders. To cut to the chase, this is one of the major difficulties, though perhaps in some sense this may also point the way to one of the opportunities of all thinking and acting around what we might or what we do often blithely called restitution or even reparation, as if we knew what these terms mean and what it would take to put them into practice. But I feel strongly about the fact that at least in certain circumstances, there may be some structural overlappings between the neo and the decolonial, for instance, between certain decolonial approaches or initiatives and neocolonial effects is not a justification for writing. That is not a justification for writing all such efforts off in a sort of relativist shrug. In fact, this is precisely the kind of situation in which the hard work of discerning and intervening begins. It shouldn't be a surprise to us, in a word, if any effort today to repatriate looted ancient cultural artifacts, for example, is necessarily caught in a web of very contemporary dynamics of power and identity, if the meaning and the effects of such efforts are necessarily bound up in such dynamics, and that these dynamics themselves are also the legacies of the very systems which underpin looting and the pressing need for restitution. And yet, if anything, precisely because history does not stop neatly with such acts of regaining, or returning to some hypothetical status quo ante, these efforts are essential, not just to gesture towards justice in the here and now, not just to acknowledge and expand and respond to past injustices, but to contribute to the possibility of what we might call a less unjust future. That Cambodia won independence from France peacefully can be seen to inflect the country's rather amicable political diplomatic relation to French colonial collections of Khmer art today, as it focuses instead on bringing loot home from the US. That the future Thailand avoided formal colonial subjugation, and that the Siamese elite counted themselves equals to European colonials plays a part still in the pivotal place of Bangkok in networks of trafficking and restitution. And that Indonesia fought its way to eventual independence is arguably reflected today in an Indonesian restitution focus on Dutch colonial collections, even as the networks that linked Indonesia and Cambodia, often via Thailand, to feed Euro-American connoisseurial appetites as they grew over the late 20th century, have been to some degree brought to light, and even as they operate still in plain sight from Indonesian grounds. On December 15, 2023, New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art announced its intention to deaccession 16 Khmer antiquities for return to Cambodia and Thailand. The returns were to include an 11th century gilded bronze statue, which had been a highlight of the Southeast Asia holdings at the Met since its acquisition in 1988. Following years of pressure from Cambodian and American authorities, the museum had officially identified the statue as one of a number in its Khmer collection associated with Douglas Latchford, a Bangkok-based British-Thai dual national indicted for antiquities trafficking by the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office in 2019. The identification should not have been a terrible challenge, given that the statue's connection to Latchford was not difficult to infer from the Met's online provenance note on the piece, indicating it to have been a gift to the museum by the American media baron cum diplomat Walter Annenberg, who had acquired it from Latchford's favored dealer, Spink & Son Limited, London. What might appear to have been more of a challenge was assigning its provenance to Cambodia or to Thailand. In a 1988 Met publication, the Met acquiring curator Martin Lerner had assigned its provenance to Thailand, but just 1 year later, in the museum's official bulletin announcing the statue's accession to its collections, Lerner switched the provenance to Cambodia. I believe the Cambodian provenance remained on the Met display label for over 3 decades. Here are photos I took of the piece on display, along with its label at the Met on October 27, 2023, less than 2 months before the announcement of its return to Thailand. Lerner worked closely with Latchford, both during his tenure at the Met and in retirement. In 2008, Latchford and Emma Bunker, a Denver Art Museum consultant and trustee who was named Latchford's co-conspirator in U.S. legal filings from 2016, themselves noted the Thai provenance in one of their 3 catalog-style publications of largely looted Khmer art. Now, the duo is in no way to be trusted on provenance, given that deception thereon comprised a key trick of their trade, that the ancient Khmer Empire expanded across what is today the Cambodian-Thai border, made the area a trafficking paradise over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. Military conflict facilitated looting, as well as the further obscuring of provenance, already inherently obscured by the nationalist framing of heritage, straddling a modern border of 2 nation-states and a contested modern border at that. Still, Lerner is no more trustworthy on public affirmations of provenance than Latchford, and the indication that Latchford and Bunker published in 2008 of an origin in Thailand and the increasingly detailed knowledge that investigators and scholars have established of Latchford's trafficking over time set provenance researchers hunting in the direction of the Thai province of Buriram, a province which is situated in what is called Thailand's northeast for its geographical relation to Bangkok and which borders northwestern Cambodia. By 2021, Thai archaeologist and restitution activist Tanongsak Hanvong had identified Thai villagers attesting to the specific find spot at the site of Prasat Banyang in Banyang Pongsadal village, Lahan Sai district, Buriram province, northeastern Thailand. Yet the Met's decision to designate the 11th century gilded bronze statue to be returned to Thailand rather than Cambodia was made without consultation with the concerned governments and without sharing any evidence of any provenance research, external or internal, such as acquisition records, technical reports, or curator notes, or even summary assessment thereof. The statue had never figured on official Thai requests for restitution from American institutions, and Thai governmental statements in the wake of the Met announcement emphasized how the Met proactively reached out to Thailand in this case, with a letter notifying the Thai government of the return hand-delivered by the Met curator on December 12th, 3 days before the public announcement. Though Han Vong had presented the evidence he and his colleagues had collected to the Thai Governmental Repatriation Committee's academic subcommittee on which he sits, the Repatriation Committee had insisted that such evidence was insufficient for Thailand to make a claim. Indeed, Han Vong himself attributed the return not to the efforts of the Thai government, but to those of the Cambodian and American authorities pressuring the Met on Latchford-associated materials. Widely called Golden Boy by the media, in eerie perpetuation of what appears to have been Latchford's erotic nickname for the piece, the statue's return triggered an extraordinary outburst of nationalist fervor on both sides of the border. Restitution authorities in Cambodia experienced the decision as revenge for their refusal to withdraw a longstanding demand that the Met return some 60 pieces in its collection to Cambodia, including the gilded bronze sculpture in question. If taken by surprise, the Thai government welcomed the return with fanfare, rolling out the red carpet, or in Buddhist terms, the ruby red ladder flanked by gold and silver ones for the statue and its entourage, acclaiming the Met for its benevolent gesture and celebrating Thailand for its conservation of ancient Khmer artistry. Cambodian and Thai social media exploded, the one with rage, the other in celebration, each feeding the nationalist fire on the other side. The acceleration of toxic, violent, hateful exchanges from both sides was veritably frightening. Golden Boy was in fact only one statue in a package of returns by the Met that included a second 11th century Khmer bronze sculpture of a female figure accompanying him to Thailand, and 14 other Khmer sculptures to Cambodia, including a number deemed of particular importance by Cambodian ministry experts, such as this bronze statue pictured here. Golden Boy stole the show for multiple entangled reasons. There's our Golden Boy. Stole the show for multiple entangled reasons, amongst which we might count the aesthetics of the piece as perceived and valued within the modern canon of ancient Khmer art, whose late 20th century construction was mediated in no minor fashion by Latchford, the statue's completeness and remarkable state of preservation, likely also due in no small part to Latchford, who partnered with international conservation specialists to complete and sometimes disguise statuary. The statue's nearly life-size, its materiality, and its hue, its association with a renowned trafficker whose other famous passion was presiding over the Thai bodybuilding world that amplified the erotic moniker, televised reporting on its late 1960s find and sale to Latchford as recounted by the villagers of Banyang Pongsadao, and the Met's noted shift in provenance. But perhaps most importantly amongst this constellation of factors, making Golden Boy so charged on either side of the border was the speculation, driven initially by Martin Lerner in his 1989 Met Bulletin note and sustained even now on the Met website with separate audio guides for adults and children, that the image represents 11th century Angkorian king Jayavarman VI. On the ground in Cambodia and Thailand, at the very least, such speculation is mediated through nationalist framings of Angkorian heritage. If the capital of Angkor was for the most part of some 6 centuries on the Angkor Plain in what is now Cambodia, the Angkorian Empire's last famed expansionist builder kings, Suryavarman II and Jayavarman VII, hailed from the Mahidarapura dynasty, whose ancestral seat is thought by many to have been located in Thailand's northeast. Provenancing an image of their ancestor in this modern northeastern Thai region serves the geohistorical hypothesis, which can be channeled itself to complicate linear models of cultural dissemination from the capital on Cambodia's Angkor Plain out, or even in stark nationalist terms, to invert identification of origins of Angkorian politico-cultural genius in modern Thailand rather than modern Cambodia. In a January 2024 panel discussion in Bangkok anticipating the Met return, Han Vong is cited as affirming the statue to be a portrait of Jayavarman VI, to then set out the import of the provenancing work in research terms. In response to the panel moderator's closing query on what Thailand stands to gain from Golden Boy's return, Han Vong responded, "This artifact illustrates the intertwined history of Thailand and Cambodia, showing that Khmer civilization once developed on the Karat Plateau, modern Thailand, before expanding southward. It challenges the traditional narrative that culture always flowed upward from the Tonle Sap region of Cambodia." Han Vong is an advocate of Thai-Cambodian solidarity in recognizing and caring for a shared heritage, and in this joins the longstanding calls of people like Hap Thuig or Brad Gordon and others in Cambodia responsible for restitution to develop joint custodianship of restituted materials whose provenance on either side of the border remains undetermined. The current impassioned environment in which Han Vong draws conclusions about the ancient politico-cultural flow is not, however, conducive to such an approach. Though the Cambodian Thai package was announced in a single press release by the Met, the actual returns were staggered, with the Cambodian return in July 2024 quietly following the loudly trumpeted Taiwan in May that year. In fact, it would appear that Cambodia's restitution authorities pointedly refused to grant the Met the public expression of gratitude, photo ops and all, that the Met pressed them for, reserving celebration for the U.S. Embassy and highlighting practices of care by Buddhist monks and National Museum staff, as you can see here. This was in stark contrast with the elaborate photo staging of cooperation between the Met and Thai authorities in Bangkok. This image, for example, shows the Director General of Thailand's Fine Arts Department, his 3 deputy directors, and the head of Thailand's national museums, all sporting the yellow color of Thai royalists, matching and enhancing the golden color of Golden Boy, with the South and Southeast Asia curator of the Met at their center, and with the statue lying prostrate in its crate at the National Museum, Bangkok, in May of 2024. In anticipation of the return, Thai villagers held a ceremony at the recollected find spot to apologize to the ancestral gods, notably Jairam VI, for the looting, and for somewhat more discreetly to call for the reinstallation of the statue there, which some deem its proper home, and which would, in many eyes, spur economic growth through tourism. I say Thai when talking about these villagers with reference to their citizenship and the nationalist framings of restitution. The area is, in fact, home to many Khmer-speaking Thai citizens, a key bit of the televised reporting that contributed to clinching the public argument that Golden Boy came from and belonged to Thailand was an interview conducted by Han Vong with an elderly village resident who recalled the finds in the 1960s. The interview had to be conducted through interpreters because the villager only speaks Khmer. Despite the effort of the Cambodian government to secure the statue's return to Cambodia and the ritual efforts of this Thai Khmer community to call him back to Buriram, Golden Boy was settled into pride of place in the Bangkok National Museum, a site embodying elite expression of Thai national identity since its foundation by the monarchy in the late 19th century on palace grounds. Tensions between Cambodia and Thailand simmered until exploding again 1 year on, this time in deadly conflict at ancient Khmer temple sites along the border. Between May and August 2025, at least 40 people and untold numbers of other living beings were killed. Many more were injured, displaced, and traumatized. 3 ancient temples were damaged. Borderland economies and ecologies were left in shreds. I was in Cambodia at the time with my co-op research group. We work on local epistemologies underpinning restitution in Southeast Asia. We're 15, but we were missing a number of our group as our Thai national members were unable to join us at this time. The border temple of Previhi had been hit the night before. Our day trip from Siem Reap to Golay temple, which is situated some 80 miles from the border from Previhi. The 2 sites, Golay and Previhi, are managed by a single national Cambodian authority, the bulk of whose administrative staff had regrouped at Golay the night before our arrival. A number of these men are my ex-students. One after the next, they said to me something like, "Puto ơi, brot tas bạch chung ptoan," which translates roughly as, "We fled with the shirts on our back," with an invocation of the Buddha reenacting the shock. The expression that they all used stuck with me, and I repeated it to others over the next few days without really knowing why. On our way back to Siem Reap that afternoon, we encountered waves of refugees fleeing the border. They were wearing more than the shirts on their backs. They were, in fact, carrying all their worldly possessions on motorized carts. Most would spend the next few days or weeks in pagodas in and around Siem Reap town. The sight was quite upsetting, and at some point, it became clear that it was central to questions that we as a group had been asking around restitution, including object cathexis with regards to the entwined affects of loss, desire, and belonging, and the concomitant appeal to religious transcendence. The objects kept, packed hastily onto carts, were paradoxically the signs or mementos of what was lost. On October 26 this year, last month, a peace declaration between Cambodia and Thailand, brokered by the current chairman of ASEAN, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, was signed at the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur. Purporting to make enduring peace between the 2 nation-states, the declaration expands on the ceasefire established between the 2 states at the end of July 2025, but fails to make concrete reference to the contested definition of borders between them. Cambodia claims temples in their surrounding land on the basis of French colonial maps and with reference to an International Court of Justice adjudication on the ownership of Previhi Temple in 1962. And has repeatedly demanded that the extended dispute be brought to the International Court. Thailand contests the authority of colonial mapping and refers to customary usage, including temple conservation in the 20th to 21st centuries, demanding that the definition of the shared border be undertaken bilaterally between the 2 states. The current American president made a pit stop in KL on his Asian tour, hovering over the Southeast Asian prime ministers at the signing ceremony and declaring to have delivered peace. Tariff pressures brought by the administration on the Southeast Asian states no doubt did play some role in hastening acquiescence on all sides. For his efforts, the U.S. president picked up a Nobel Peace Prize nomination from Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet. The very many people who hope the peace will last are by and large aware that the ceremonial spectacle obscures ever-competing claims to heritage, tethered as they are to ever-competing claims to sovereignty over land, and it's becoming a very familiar picture. To come back home otherwise and to our first golden boy, let me note that back in April 2024, the Thai Governmental Department of Fine Arts signed an MOU with the Met to, quote, formalize a shared commitment to collaborate on exchanges and expertise and the display and study of Thai art. This has already led to multiple events in Bangkok, bringing together museum authorities, political figures, and UNESCO on not just Thai, but more broadly Southeast Asian regional heritage. Notable among these was a November 2024 event conjoining the ceremonial return of Banchang artifacts to Thailand by the U.S. government and a seminar on illicit trafficking, co-hosted by the Thai Fine Arts Department, the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, and the UNESCO Asia-Pacific Regional Bureau in Bangkok, and held at the National Museum Bangkok. The event featured a panel discussion with Lucien Simmons, who, unbelievably, had left Sotheby's Action House to take on just months prior, in May 2024, the Met's newly created head of provenance post. As I understand it, Cambodian restitution and museum authorities declined the invitation to participate. A review of the event was quickly published in the Journal of the Siam Society. Today, November 6, 2025, this morning, I suppose, the director of the Met himself, Max Hollein, delivered a talk at the Bangkok premises of the Siam Society, this privileged Thai site of public dissemination of research on Thai and Khmer art and archaeology since its foundation under Thai royal patronage in 1904, which patronage it continues to enjoy. The Siam Society, animated then as now as much by Thai as by foreign scholars, was the Thai answer to the French colonial FAO and the Dutch Royal Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences. Like the others, the Siam Society is not only a privileged site of research and its dissemination, but also a political punch, a forum in which research comprises a political performance of sovereignty, wholly integrated into the diplomatic choreographies that allowed Siam to remain independent as its neighbors came under European colonial dominion. It is to this day a place which continues to participate in the triangulation of international diplomacy, Southeast Asian internal relations, and research on art and archaeology. Max Hollein's talk was entitled The Universal Museum in a Globalized World. Under the Siam Society logo celebrating the institution's 120th year of operations, the poster features a view of the Met built and photographed to impress. As you know, the expression universal museum is a kind of oxymoron. The idea that a particular collection of particular objects could somehow transcend these concrete particularities in order to represent or embody universal culture. A museum in which each contingent object in the collection, contingent both as a particular cultural artifact and in terms of its provenance and the history of its collection, is somehow understood to sublate or overcome its singularity and enter a universal sphere of culture. And of course, from this perspective, the Universal Museum is understood to have anticipated by decades, if not centuries, the advent of our globalized world. The programming is remarkable. 1 week from today, the UNESCO career diplomat and international lawyer, previously director of UNESCO's Asia-Pacific Regional Bureau, Etienne Clément, will himself deliver a talk at the Siam Society entitled, Is it a Good Idea to Return Displaced Cultural Objects to Their Country of Origin? The presumably rhetorical form of the question in the title is indicative of the fine line UNESCO walks between the one hand proponents of the Universal Museum and the cosmopolitan elite that both uphold it and are upheld by it, even as it purports to globalize democratization of access, and on the other, the complex Southeast Asian regional elite whose investments in restitution are varied and variable, not unlike their government signatures or lack thereof on the UNESCO 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. Thailand has not yet ratified this document, which is nonetheless proven key to restitution of looted materials on the Southeast Asian mainland. Let me pivot now to another recent case of restitution in Southeast Asia, the return by Dutch authorities to Jakarta authorities of a Balinese kris. In August 2023, the return happened. What you see on the screen, a table comprising an image of the kris in question with data, naming, custodian, possessor, inventory number, materials, measurements, opens the March 2022 report number 31 of the Pilot Project Provenance Research on Objects of the Colonial Era, a report commissioned by Dutch authorities. A second series of close-ups of the kris, accompanied by a more detailed description, leading to a suggestion for further, or is accompanied by a more detailed description and leads to a suggestion for further research. And I quote here, the wavy blade of the kris has patterns and shades of gray obtained by forging together different steel layers containing iron and nickel. There are 6 precious stones on the gold ring joining the blade to the hilt. The curved gold hilt is inlaid with 24 gemstones. The kris's inventory cards in the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden collection management system indicate that the figure on the hilt is a malignant demon. But according to European literature, the deity Bayu is usually depicted on figurative Balinese kris hilts. Besides the hilt, the sheath is also indicative of a Balinese provenance. The ivory sheath opening transitions into a speckled wood sheath, which is part gilt and part silver, plated on one side. A motif of flowers and tendrils can be seen at the top of the gilded section. Further research in cooperation, I'm quoting still, further research in cooperation with Indonesian kris experts could therefore focus, amongst other things, on identifying the figure on the hilt. Anthropologist Margaret Wiener's gloss on kris in the opening of her 2017 article, Things in Uncommon, is worth quoting at length as a complement and a challenge to the above description, notably as the latter frames further research. And now I quote from her text. Kris are much more than long daggers. They are renowned for the patterns resulting from hammering laminations of iron and nickel onto their double-edged asymmetrical blades, many of which undulate like a snake in motion. Even when fitted with magnificent hilts and sheaths, the blade is what counts. Once part of male formal dress, many kris remain treasured heirlooms, material links to ancestors. A subset of these daggers receive names, including honorifics, and a smaller subset yet achieve fame. Named weapons featured as lead characters in stories about the power of Bali's oldest dynasty in Klungkung, which traced its origins to Majapahit's conquest of the island. Their prominence in oral narratives reiterated their centrality in written chronicles about the origins and rise of powerful clans across Bali. In such texts, acquiring a named kris as an ally, frequently as a gift from a superior, either human or more than human, marked a man out for greatness. Provided they received appropriate care, such kris manifested remarkable abilities across generations. This kris was one of 472 objects returned to Indonesia in an act constituting a turning point, a point of no return, some have suggested, in Dutch conceptualization and political implementation of restitution. Though claims for the repatriation of objects looted or otherwise transferred to the Netherlands during Dutch colonial occupation had been officially made since independence negotiations in the post-World War II period, it would take until 2021 for the Netherlands to respond to such repeated requests with a political framework designed to enable proactive provenancing research within Dutch museums and systematic processes for inviting and responding to Indonesian requests, as well as for actually making the returns. The 2023 return of 472 objects was the concrete fruit for Indonesia of this Dutch political framework. Let me quote again from the March 2022 pilot project on the soon-to-be restituted object named a ceremonial kris and inventoried as RV 3600-193 in the Volkenkunde Museum, Leiden. The report opens. The provenance investigation has confirmed that the weapon was looted by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army in April 1908 during the Puputan, the fight to the end ritual in Klungkung, Bali. The provenance investigation was unable to establish whether this happened on the battlefield or afterwards in the Royal Palace of Klungkung. It was similarly not established whether the kris was the property of Dewa Agung Jambe II, the ruler of Klungkung, or someone close to him. Some of the spoils of war taken by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army from Klungkung in November 1908 were shipped to the Netherlands. The objects were divided up between a number of museums, with the kris being transferred in March 1909 to the Ethnographic Museum of the Royal Military Academy in Breda, whose collection was taken over in 1956 by the Volkenkunde Museum in Leiden. The 1908 military campaign was the result of Balinese resistance led by Deva Agung Jambe II, the ruler of Klung Kung, to the monopolization of the opium trade by the Dutch colonial administration. A puputan took place after Dutch troops arrived at the Palace of Klung Kung on 28th of April, 1908. During this fight to the end ritual, the ruler died along with over 100 family members and others close to him when, bearing krisses and lances, they advanced towards Dutch gunfire. Approximately 50 Balinese were also wounded. Afterwards, a few survivors were banished to Lombok. The Puputan in Klung Kung marked the end of a long series of Dutch military expeditions on Bali that had started in 1846. As far as the Dutch side was concerned, the pacification of the island was deemed to be complete. There was now direct or indirect colonial administration everywhere. This is the King of Klung Kung in 2024, whom I had the pleasure of meeting thanks to Indonesian cultural heritage specialist Hangga Adiansyah and Gede Made Dananda Parimata Susila, a law student working for the Dutch Westerlaken Foundation in Bali, which advocates for the return of Klung Kung heirlooms to the current king of Klung Kung. Since the Puputan of 1908, however, and while there is thus a king, there has been no kingdom per se. So in technical terms, this man, Ida Dalem Smaraputra, is the head of the clan, which plays a largely ceremonial and cultural role in the Balinese regency of Klung Kung. He is a descendant of Ida I Deva Agung Gede Jambe, the last king of Klung Kung, who led the 1908 Puputan and died in it. The lineage is curated by the family in multiple manners, here in a photo composition in a public gallery in the Klung Kung Palace today, where you see a photo of the current king set in the vertical axis above a montage of his famous ancestor. The story of the 1908 Klung Kung Puputan, as I heard it there, is that, besieged by the Dutch, the king, his court, and followers surged en masse out of the palace, dressed in white, bearing jewelry, regalia, and krisses. Hurling the jewels at the Dutch soldiers, they fell on their own krisses. Whatever the actual forms of the act of self-sacrifice took by the Klung Kung collective or individuals therein, it was indeed a fight to the end of the Klung Kung kingdom with few survivors on the Klung Kung side. At the same time, it was a fight meant to rob the victors of their victory, as the Balinese were not defeated by the Dutch, but took their own lives. Here is one way the Puputan is publicly commemorated in Smarapura, the seat of the Klung Kung Regency today. This enormous modern monument in the form of a Balinese linga is situated across the road from the former Klung Kung Royal Palace grounds in the town of Smarapura. The former palace grounds, dating to the 17th century, is now a tourist attraction, including a museum. The current king lives with members of his family a few steps down the road in a palace built in the late 1920s. Visitors are invited inside the giant linga. At the center, they will find a life-size statuary ensemble of Ida I Deva Agung Gede Jambe, the last sovereign king of Klung Kung, and family members. The statuary ensemble appears to be a translation into space of an iconic photograph that features widely in reworked forms across Klung Kung public spaces, such as the one I showed earlier, which includes the Linga monument itself in the montage, as you can see, the one here in the center. A diorama unfolds along the linga's interior walls, telling the Klung Kung story in episodes that convey the cultured refinement of the Klung Kung actors as much as their valor in armed combat. Krisses figure prominently in the imagery, but not raised in combat. They are instead tucked into the back waist folds of the men's lower garments, appearing more like an exoskeleton than a weapon, as you can see on this prostrate figure. The Klung Kung Puputan Kriss, as it is often referred to, inventoried in the Leiden Volkenkunde Museum as RV 3600-193, was among the Klung Kung heirlooms to be looted on April 28, 1908. The Klung Kung spoils were quickly inventoried and shipped to the capital of the Dutch East Indies in Batavia. By November of that year, the Dutch Governor General had allocated one portion of the Klung Kung spoils to eligible museums in the Netherlands, a second portion to the Royal Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences, which was to become the National Museum of Indonesia after independence, and a third portion for sale. By in November 1908, the Kris in question was aboard a steamship to Rotterdam. By 1909, it was part of the collections of the Ethnographic Museum of the Royal Military Academy at Breda, a teaching collection used to train non-commissioned officers preparing to work in the Dutch East Indies. In 1956, the ethnographic collection of the Royal Academy was integrated into the Leiden Volkenkunde Museum, where it remained until restitution to Jakarta in 2023. The current king of Klungkung is not impressed. He and his family members have long pressed for restitution of Klungkung heirlooms from the National Museum in Jakarta and from the Netherlands. There have been various initiatives by family members over time to seek the return of Klungkung krises. Some have indeed been identified by name, but doing so is challenging as Dutch colonial processes of appropriation retain materials at the expense of names, and as these processes have themselves largely been retained in post-colonial museology in Jakarta as elsewhere. In contrast, Klungkung heirs can recollect Kris names without having knowledge of their forms. For the centenary commemoration of the Klungkung Puputan in 2008, the Klungkung court was required to, what he said, rent Klungkung heirlooms held in the National Museum of Jakarta. The Kris named Ardawalika and the tombak, the spear, named Ki Baru Gudung. These mystic weapons were accompanied in their travels by curators and police from Jakarta, and the encounter of overlapping but divergent worlds that ensued has been nicely analyzed by anthropologist Margaret Weiner in her 2017 article that I cited earlier. The framework adopted by the Dutch in 2021 stipulates that restitution can be made on a state-to-state basis only. The measure appears to reflect a principle of non-intervention into another state's sovereign affairs. This respect for other nations' sovereignty may be a standard tenet of international relations, but in cases like this, it is also a post or even anti-colonial gesture, making a point of abandoning the colonial strategies of dividing and conquering, disrespecting and disregarding indigenous power structures. And yet, at the same time, this very restraint may effectively play out in a neo-colonial mode, for example, here, where local authorities may feel dispossessed in turn by their central government. And a similar dynamic plays out on the so-called giving or returning end. The Met in particular is a case, though it's arguably only a symptom or a particularly visible synecdoche for the larger dynamics of the art market in the broadest sense, the vast, deep, well-oiled web of interrelated interests extending between collectors, museums, dealers, high finance and money laundering, diplomacy, looting, and antiquities trafficking networks, and of course, academia. It may simply be the optics, as they say, but this hallowed institution wouldn't do anything differently if it wanted to give the impression that it operates according to a neo-colonial Cold War playbook, both in its collecting, as one of Latchford's main clients and enablers for decades, of course unwitting, the Met now says, and in its ever so undisinterested playing off of Thailand against Cambodia around this border issue, though again, it's possible perhaps that Met officials are unaware or insufficiently aware of the geodiplomatico-political consequences of their actions, things as apparently innocuous as the timing or wording of a press release, et cetera. And as for Golden Boy, you couldn't have dreamed up a more perfect storm. This is one of the most breathtaking artifacts of ancient Cambodian culture, which was looted from a Khmer-inflected Thai province on the Cambodian border and given pride of place in one of the highest profile Western collections of ancient Khmer statuary, and whose return participated, whether intentionally or not, in a bitter, bloody, full-on nationalist border dispute, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. So what to do? How to even begin thinking about what to do? And I think this latter question is essential. The question of restitution today is not one we're going to answer once and for all. It's important to repeat because as many people have pointed out, restitution seems superficially to already be the answer to its question. The answer is right there in the word: what's stolen should be given back. But remember what Levinas says about the law of the talion. It's not a recipe for bloody retribution, as it's often assumed to be. On the contrary, by tailoring the punishment to be commensurate with the crime, it is precisely an attempt to interrupt the endless cycles of revenge. But even here, it's not exactly what it seems. Surely what was stolen should be restituted. But what if it can't be? What if it can, but it can't at the same time? There is no such thing as justice in the world, and that's the hard, immovable problem that all human systems of justice, what we call justice, constantly, repeatedly, forever break on like waves against a cliff. The first step is certainly restitution. The stubborn, unrelenting resistance to it surely confirms the urgency of this basic endeavor. But what about Golden Boy? Where does he properly belong? Surely he's happier in Southeast Asia than in Midtown Manhattan. But would everything be right if he were in the National Museum in Phnom Penh rather than the Bangkok one? Or if the Puputan Chris were in the Klungkung Palace rather than the National Museum in Jakarta? Clearly, there's no argument here not to repatriate. Yet I would even say that, preposterous as it may sound, I'm not insensitive to some of the appeal of the Universal Museum, at least to the extent that it is an attempt to place side-by-side cultural artifacts from all over the world. For one thing, while it is a model that has its roots in old ethnocentric Enlightenment ideas of civilizational hierarchies and justifications for colonial domination, it also lends itself to something quite different, what I would call a kind of structuralist challenge to all of that, the revolutionary, radically relativist idea that cultural differences are the surface manifestations of some deep, universal, human cultural rules. The rich, fascinating, yet superficial differences in parole, that all reflect the same basic underlying langue. Still, the one history is inseparable from the other, and still, the Universal Museum thrives at those sites which mark the heights of capital. Luckily for us, we live in an age of 3D printing and deep fakes. Our Universal Museums can take inspiration from the Buddha, the Buddha statue, and multiply our likenesses. But the story of the Buddha and his statue of the becoming statue of the Buddha is also that of the becoming Buddha of the statue. Even Walter Benjamin, the original champion of aura, loved nothing more than cinema and mechanical reproduction. In any case, we need a double approach because for all sorts of reasons, restitution, at least in its simple acceptation, while necessary, is far from sufficient. Indeed, restitution, even reparations, is the easy part. But it's also the occasion to continue thinking about this impossible and necessary task, and in the meantime, to insist that this thinking be accompanied by doing with shared collaborative living initiatives around knowledge production, not only in the hopes of learning from the past under the motto of never again, but also to actively prepare or accompany a future for living culture beyond the art market and its insatiable commodity fetishism. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We welcome questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very provocative and performative talk. I have a question because you're looking at the Golden Boy and you're looking at this very famous Chris from Klungkung and knowing Margaret Wiener's work, the importance of collecting local narratives of the material life of these things. So I'm thinking of the role of metallurgy here and the combining of metals. And in the case of Pamor, like the Buddha rising up in the sky with elemental force of fire and water, the same kinds of things drive the logic of restitution for local people who remember the Puputan, not that so many people are still alive who remember it, but who remember it through trance in the case of this. So I'm wondering, in this desire for a shared restitution, which I completely embrace, is it important to collect these local narratives in which the materiality of these objects, they are propelling themselves home? If you talk to the Raja of Klungkung, he's not renting that. The force of the object is bringing itself home. And it has nothing to do with the current politics. So I wondered if you could address that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure you know a lot more about this case than I do, or about not necessarily the restitution case, but about the context out of which it comes. So I can't, I don't know a lot about the details of the context. But I would say that, yes, in the first instance, sort of collecting local knowledge. I mean, local comes at all levels, right? But collecting all levels of local knowledge and certainly on the materiality and the connections to the materiality and to the materiality, but also to the processes of making and using seems to me to be really, really important in thinking about these. And certainly the Golden Boy is a very different example insofar as it's something that was in the ground. It's not something that was in use and looted in that way. And it was looted in a post-colonial situation, et cetera. But nonetheless, I think that that's the sort of some of the questions I tried to bring up in the kind of coveting of that particular figure are not just on the side of the Western market. They're also on the side of folks even in the village where it was discovered because of its materiality and its hue. Just one point on the way that the objects are propelling themselves home. It seems to me that in my afternoon conversation, so very limited, my afternoon conversation through translators, et cetera, who I was with, or colleagues who could translate. It strikes me that on two registers, he was speaking to us at least on two registers. As I understand it, and my colleagues may correct me on this, but as I understand it, he was using the term rent. That's how it was translated to me. He was using that term as a complaint that the insurance was very high to take things, and that the local committee, they had to pay that insurance, and that was an insult. And so he had to rent it. And that was, that's how he interpreted the insurance question. So that was, yes, it was propelling itself home, but it couldn't make itself home. And he had to shell out they had to shell out the money to get Jakarta to allow them to have their own thing. So he was really working on both of those registers. And one was a very political and angry register. And also angry, I should say angry at, people like me who come and say, tell us about this situation, because he's sick of it. And it's been years, and it's not only been years of his life, it's been years of his predecessors' lives spent trying to get this stuff back. And so I think on the one hand, it's a very concrete action on their part. And it is an action on a political real register. In another way, yes, absolutely. It's the objects themselves that are propelling themselves in that way. And so I suppose that's also why I'm sort of thinking of this question of the process of restitution. I mean, I see the process of restitution as an opportunity, and an opportunity to take art history as an opportunity to transform art historical method. And that opportunity is often missed in certain contexts, and it can be missed. I think there are National Museum contexts where the dial can be shifted, et cetera, but it's very, very difficult in those contexts. Outside of those contexts, shifting interpretation is dependent upon having those kind of conversations that you're talking about, I think. Yeah. There was one other thing I was thinking, but I forgot.
We have several questions online, so perhaps we can alternate between the online community and the in-person community. An anonymous attendee asks or says, thanks for being here today. Welcome to Cornell's Southeast Asia program. For the question, Southeast Asia has been one of the strongest Theravada communities for a long time. How will the history of Theravada reflect ASEAN's modernity amidst political turmoil between Thailand and Cambodia and the US's tariff effects? Thanks.
So thank you. So how will the Theravada...
how will the history of Theravada reflect ASEAN's modernity amidst political turmoil between Thailand and Cambodia and the US's tariff effects?
Yeah, thank you for a question. I'd say a very, very complicated question. I do know that there have been, certainly the, so a number of things to say. On one level, there is no Theravada Pope, right? There is no singular authority that unites Theravadan countries. And the Sangha, the orders within each country are the orders, the Theravadan orders are organized in national terms. That's not necessarily conducive to, let's say, a policy or a development of custodianship and a sort of calming of the waters, calming of the fires between the two states at this point. So I wouldn't extract the monastic orders from the political order that is working right now in ways that are quite detrimental. However, of course, there is potential there, and there are initiatives there, whether they be cross-border initiatives or whether they be, and there were some walks for peace, for example, some monastic or some Buddhist-led, monastic-led walks for peace, precisely during this problem. But I noted, for example, that the monastic-led walks for peace that I saw online after I had left Cambodia in August of this year, were very clearly signposted with Theravadan flags, so including all 5 Theravadan nations, right, Thailand and Cambodia together, and Cambodian national flags in the Cambodia context. So I think it's not to be abstracted, but there are, of course, initiatives that can be informal government initiatives that can be, short of the peace declaration signing, and that can be intra-monastic order initiatives that are important. Obviously, when the materials come home, whether it be to Thailand or to Cambodia, they are reintegrated, almost systematically. They're reintegrated through Buddhist ceremonies. And those ceremonies can be channeled to particular nationalist purposes that are quite potent right now in the relationship with Thailand, but they can also transcend that. And so there is some sort of possibility there. I suppose one thing to think about with all of this is that while Thailand and Cambodia, obviously there are other states concerned. Myanmar is a whole other issue right now with a lot of stuff obviously going out to Bangkok, for example. But while there is a shared Theravadan heritage, the materials that by and large were looted from the 1960s on are not Theravadan Buddhist imagery. So it's earlier stuff. It's stuff prior to this rise and spread of Theravada across the mainland. So that becomes a kind of complicated thing, and it's more a question of Angkorian heritage, which is shared, and then that is adopted by and reintegrated into now these Theravadan Buddhist states that have these sort of alternative paths towards building nation-state identity vis-a-vis the Angkorian heritage and with Theravada. And so there are options there, anonymous online. But I'm speaking to you as if you have this question for me. Sorry, a lot of expectations. Yeah, it's not an easy solution, I guess. And then the other sort of thing to say there is, my response was a knee-jerk response of the monastics, and what about the non-monastics? That is, what about all the women? That's a big issue in restitution, that it's man, man, man.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you for setting me up for my question.
Thank you, Magnus, for setting me up for my talk.
I was going to ask you about the men, because I remember from reading your Engendering of the Buddhist State about how, well, you were uncovering, revealing, exposing the role of certain prominent but semi-forgotten women, queens in ancient old Cambodia that had a massive influence in the course of things, and that sort of resuscitation that you were engaging in, you framed it in the book as a part of this discussion with Sheldon Pollock's Language of the Gods in the World of Men. And I kept thinking about this phrase, in the world of men, as you were showing us these pictures, and I was struck by how this is so much about a man's prestige, a man's power, perhaps competition between Jakarta and Klong Klong, and competition between Cambodia and and Thailand. But what does gender have to do with it? And is there some similar factor coming into play in the restitution? Is there some kind of possibility of taking this in a different direction? If you ask, like you did, what does the gender have to do with it? Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. I mean, I do think that the state-to-state orientation of restitution in the cases that I've spoken about today is dependent upon and then reconsolidates a phallic order. I think that's certainly there. Not to say that there aren't women. How do you say this? There aren't women political figures or players in various ways who are not participating in all of it. So I think that's one level. That's one level of the state-to-state situation. There are, of course, restitution processes that either come short of the state or very intentionally evade the state. And those processes, so I have a lovely colleague who works very, very closely with what she calls, or what some people would call, and sometimes she uses the term, rematriation. So she's really not working on the state level. Often she's intervening with state officials in order to do something to make it possible to do something different in the Philippines, and with National Museum in order to do something elsewhere, right? So I think that's one important answer, and I think it is in many situations a very conscious answer to this problem. So that's one thing. Within the state-to-state things, I've kind of given you a caricature of things, right? In some situations, who's to say a man is a man? Who's to say a woman is a woman, right? It seems to me that's a very rigid way of interpreting what's happening, even in this situation. I had some slides that I didn't develop on this question. One was about the figures of the women that appeared in the first part of my talk. The kneeling woman figure, the Buddha's mother, the woman who, the Khmer-speaking Thai villager who was very important in clinching the public argument through her testimony about what she saw. And the kind of posture of these women, which is, I mean, I'll put it in sort of material terms. The posture of the women are not standing up, the women are sitting down, the women are kneeling, and they're also overlooked for that reason. So I think, why was all of the money was put on Golden Boy with his moniker, et cetera, whereas this kneeling female figure is an exceedingly important statue in terms of the rarity, in terms of the size, in terms of all the same kinds of things you might say about the Golden Boy, you could say about her, but it's as if she didn't exist, right? And so it's a question for me, again, there's an opportunity, and there's an opportunity even in these state things that are happening, there's an opportunity to take a second look and to open our eyes to other things that are going on and to make those things come to the fore in certain ways. That's not a very good answer, but it's something. Let me just say one more thing about the rematriation question, is that, so okay, you invert the binary, right? Instead of repatriation, we do rematriation. I think it's important to think about the switching of the terminology and what that does to the switching of the practices, and again, sort of come to art historical practice, what that might do in terms of shifting modes of knowledge production. But I don't think that's a final answer, because I think that purporting to put the woman assumes that we know what a woman is, and purporting to put her in the place of the man re-erects the situation of, re-erects to some degree always the phallic order. So that terminology and the processes that are attached to it maybe need to be a little bit separated from each other and thought through in my mind. But yeah, it's an important question. And this sort of the big, one element that I left out is also the sort of environmental element of these processes of extraction that is also left out in the process of return the minute that it's a state to state and it goes into the National Museum and it stops there. So the local level is also a local level of ecologies. And I tried to sort of say that when thinking about what happened at the border in July, this past July. What happened at the border in this past July was also a terrible environmental massacre. And what happened with the looting from the 1960s on in the Cambodia-Thai area was also, obviously, genocide was happening at some point of it, and but it was part of an extractive process that destroyed the environment and that really shifts the ways people can live now in those places. So there's the social order, the environmental order, and they really go together. And I think part of thinking the question of rematriation, repatriation, maybe needs to be triangulated with that question of the environment. So this is also, I'm sort of speaking for some colleagues of mine who are quite interested in this and who I'm learning from at the moment. So, yeah. Pat had a question, yeah.
Yeah.
Question. I find the word stolen rather problematic, right? You're talking about stolen. What is stolen? What is looted, right? And what is to repatriate? Because the case of Golden Boy is quite different from the case of the Chris, right? One is just being villages digging up something and then selling it, right? And so when you talk about this issue, how to determine what should be returned? Because if you think of, there are many things, I mean, if you talk about Chinese imperial ware, they're all over the place, right? If the Chinese decide that they want all this back, what will happen? And there's also political issues, like the one in the Golden Boy issue, is that I was once in Laos, in Vientiane, at the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, and there's a sign said that the Emerald Buddha used to be here, but is now in a foreign country, right? Without saying where it is. And so that is an issue also. Is that looted or should be restituted?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, to that last point, yes, absolutely. I think it's another reason why, in my mind, it's a very complex question. And if there's continuity between, what you might think of as the Emerald Buddha or as, even the Hiram and the seventh bronzes that are in Mandalay, for example, these kinds of, booty, right? Pre-modern looting, right? Pre-modern circulation of objects through, repossession of palladia, et cetera. Is there a continuity between that and then what we see in the 20th century? That's a question. And how do you think about that continuity and difference? But to come to the question of looting, yes, of the sort of difference between the Golden Boy and the massacre of the Balinese court in the early 20th century. Yes, and those are very different situations. One is a colonial situation of literal looting. Another is a post-colonial situation of what I would call literal looting. Why? Yes, the villagers were digging, as she said. Oh, maybe I didn't show you that video. She says we were digging for potatoes. Me and we were digging for potatoes, and we found this thing. Yes and no. Latchford set himself up lived in Bangkok, right? But set himself up to start buying there, right? And so used a village house that was, he stayed with one family in that village and used that house as his sort of, center. And he paid people to loot. And that's how he began. That it seems, from what we're beginning to understand, it seems that that's how he began his work. So it was looting. It wasn't. And he from that he built up extraordinarily extensive networks of on the Cambodian side. militarized gangs who were working in, specific hierarchies through brokers to him. And at this point, yes, they were, in this village, and for the Golden Boy, it was in the beginning of that, and they were digging potatoes, and they came across that. But it was something that he was encouraging at this point, and this was, digging potatoes is also part of digging for gold in this context. And he's facilitating and making the looting happen. It's not just chance. He's providing the market, and he's literally, there's other people, right? I'm sort of easy to use his name. He's making that happen. And I think it needs to be acknowledged as such. That was looting. That was looting, and it continued to be looting until quite recently. It's different from colonial looting. It's very different from colonial looting. But it's in some ways more clear cut. So, yeah.
Thanks for this very enlightening presentation. And I'm going to come at this from an outsider's perspective. And so forgive me if my question is obvious or silly. But I'm interested in the difference between Golden Boy and the Chris here. I presume that when they're out of the places where they're from, they're put in some sort of display case and we're meant to look at it, right? But it's meant to be preserved and untouched. And I was struck by how he's wearing gloves here, right? As if perhaps he's making it at risk. But that Chris, perhaps unlike Golden Boy, is meant to do something, right? It's not, its natural state is not preserved. Its natural state is not behind glass for others to look at. It's an object that has, I guess I'm asking, it has a role in the world as an actor, and presumably it could lose its magic or its powers in a way that makes it refuse, right? In a way that maybe Golden Boy wouldn't, but this one could. And so how does somebody think about the role that the objects are supposed to play, rather than, like, when we put them in museums, we just gaze at them and preserve them and keep them in some sort of imagined pristine condition. But their function and their natural state is not to go back and be in some similar condition in another country, but to do something else entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just as an aside, I think he's wearing, because Margaret Weiner wrote about this, I think he's wearing gloves. There's his brother also with some cloth over his hand to hold it. I think that was the Jakarta curators that required that. So no, it's the Jakarta curators. I mean, that required that they not be held directly. So yes, I mean, I would just come back to the Golden Boy question. So in a village religious environment, the 11th century statue, I'm not going to call him Golden Boy anymore. I've talked to many journalists and told them I refuse to use this term, and here I am using it, but I want to put it in quotes. But so that that statue would also be doing something, would very much be doing something. Now, this statue was under the ground. It's not something that was it wasn't in the process of being venerated, as many 11th century statues could have been, right? But it wasn't. It was dug up, and it was sold off as an artifact or sold off for the money at the time. But so two things. That statue doesn't have to go back to its original being, its original state, in order to have agency vis-a-vis those villagers. So when they performed a ceremony to apologize to their ancestors or to the gods, same thing, to Hiram VII, for having looted him, they're also participating in his agency, right? They're also imbuing that image with agency in order to give them prosperity. And that's working on two levels. There is a kind of tourism, economic, political level. Would be nice to get him back here. But there's also a religious level where there's a religious or a social level where there's a process of enabling him to enable them. And so whether or not he was under, this is often a sort of, often a rationale that's used by museums to say, well, that piece was just, thrown off to the side. That piece was, nobody really venerated it. Oh, that piece was under the ground, et cetera. That doesn't mean that there's not a kind of, a sort of a vitality that is in operation the minute it comes out of the ground. And also as a kind of caution about the sort of documentation of, it was discarded, it was abandoned. That's very often not the case. So you'll see colonial records that say we found it on the ground. We found it, people were not paying attention to it. Well, there are ways that people pay attention to things that are not necessarily recognizable to colonial eyes. So that's a problematic argument. So and for this Chris as well, obviously it's, this Chris obviously it's gone through that transformation of having been asceticized through the European vitrine, right? That's part of the process of sort of removing the power that it had, and quite explicitly on the Dutch part to remove the power that it had by doing that to it. But it doesn't, I would say that, what's happening with it now, or in this picture, is not just going back to its natural state. There's not a natural state, right? It's adopting a state in the here and now, right? There's a new state in the here and now the minute this guy holds it, right? So, and I would even go back to my, my photograph of the people with all their objects on their cart as they're fleeing from the border. On the one hand, that was the basics for survival. They needed cooking pots, they needed whatever. On the other hand, that was really, there's an object cathexis there, right? It's like getting everything you can, right? Taking everything you can, because you don't know if you're going to be able to come back. You don't know. And there's a way in which that the objects themselves enable the survival of those people, and not just a pragmatic way. And I think that's operating in these comings and goings in important ways, almost no matter what the object is. Textile, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Thompson. Actually, it's a very, very inspiring one, and it also kind of allowed me to think of what I'm analyzing is like the chakra Donial bell that was given by like Zheng He in the 15th century in China, and then all the way to Aceh, and then looted by Portuguese in the Navy, and then going back to right now in Aceh Museum again. But then my question is a little bit different. So I'm working on sound as a cultural form. So I'm kind of like thinking about two questions, like the location of sovereignty. Is it like does your analysis, or does this kind of power or the effect of restitution has so much to do with like where is the location? Can the location of sovereign to be like elites, or like the venerated god, or like this symbolic symbol of a king, or can it be just to be kind of like diffuse in a more diffuse way, like for example the society? For example, if we are thinking about oral tradition like folk songs and all these things, there are a lot of controversy related to which country, which nation states are allowed to apply for the to make a claim about intangible cultural heritage to the UNESCO. For example, like Pantun in Indonesia and Malay, it's like they both enjoy that intangible cultural heritage, but who got to say that it's their claim? And also for China and Korea, they also have this kind of similar thing. So maybe my question is like, to what extent the explanatory tour of this reconstitution as a process of decolonization or reflection about neo-colonization to do with the location of sovereignty? Can it be an immaterial form of culture? Can it be intangible culture? And also, can it be something related to not necessarily the like a convergent point attached to like a god or attached to a king, but just within the population, within the public.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, I think a very complex question. And I suppose I started out with one of those questions in trying to think about the multi-scalar process that goes on, where you have individuals, local communities, all the way up to the state, to the regional, to the international, et cetera, scale. And and also about affect. And it seems to me that the question of sovereignty in the ways that you're thinking about it might be thought through questions around affect. And how is the individual affect, how is it articulated up to the national level? That seems to me to be quite important. So I suppose what I'm saying with these objects, that they're not in any way simply tangible objects, right? That they come with the intangible, and that's what's driving them. I mean, at some point I referred to vitality, right? They have their sort of, there's a mutual process of giving vitality back and forth, and maybe that's the kind of, what did you say, the people, or a sort of collective that's short of state identity. And maybe that's something that is worth thinking through that route, the sort of mutual giving and vitality. Not to say that doesn't also happen on the national level. It's, one can look at the state level and its sort of state level restitution and be exceedingly, critical and think, oh, this is instrumentalization, et cetera. It may be, but it's not. Almost ever is it only that there is this intense emotion, which is both the part of the individual who's operating the diplomatic process, and or the relationship to that person has with the collective that's sort of responding with him or her to it. So, and all of that is on the order of the intangible, but it's mediated through this object. So, yeah, I mean, the whole kind of division between the tangible and the intangible that UNESCO has introduced into our world, I think, is problematic, and sort of leads us down the wrong road in thinking about how these things work, and why restitution evokes such powerful emotions. Yeah. But sound, of course, is a very, I'd love to hear more about that. I mean, very interesting in thinking about the diffusion and sort of processes of identification that go through the diffusion of sound in ways that are dematerial, but also grounded in materiality. So yeah, interesting to think about. Yeah, yeah.
For the sake of time, I'll read perhaps one more question from online, and this comes from Lawrence Chua. Thank you for the inspiring and evocative lecture. I was wondering whether I could draw you out a bit more about the transformations that occur in the migration of the object from a religious exhibitionary context as an, quote, object of veneration to a, quote, secular exhibitionary context as an art object to a symbol of modern sovereignty in their restitution to a national museum. You've alluded to the religious rituals that accompanied the restitution of some of these artifacts to the National Museum in Cambodia. Knowing what we do of the ways the Sangha has historically been a force in nation-making in Southeast Asia, how do the contemporary Cambodian and Thai Sangha understand the restitution of these artifacts? Do they offer another way of understanding restitution of these objects beyond the recovery of national symbols? Beyond their recovery as national symbols?
Thank you. Is that Lawrence?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Lawrence. Yes. So I'm just going to sort of ride on the tail end of your question. I think there were more complicated things in the beginning that I should attend to, and I'm looking forward to doing so in reading your question. But the monastic, the question of the Buddhist order, and do they offer something other than the state the state interpretation, is that kind of, I'm looking at you again as if you know what you're talking about, but I mean, maybe you do, but or you know what Lawrence is talking about. The state order, does the monastic order do something other than the state? And knowing what we do know about the history of Theravada Buddhism and its symbiotic relationship with the Sangha's symbiotic relationship with state order, does it make a difference? I guess I would come back to my suggestion that we open out that we take this as an opportunity to open out our perception of what the Buddhist community is, and that we allow ourselves to surface the elements of monastic practice, such as conservation and care of materials within pagoda grounds, which is very, very potent and quite in some ways complementary to, in some ways different from, sometimes assimilating museum practices of appreciation, but often finding themselves somewhere around the margins of that. But that we also look outside of the monastic order to think about how people, and maybe I would come back to this village in Thailand with the community, how they are perhaps elaborating relationships to materials which are not dependent upon state control. And I think that happens it can happen within temple grounds. I would say it can even happen within national museums. Those of you who have spent time in the Phnom Penh National Museum over the past decade or so will certainly have noticed, if you get there early enough in the morning, all these women who appear from villages, and maybe they're visiting their children who are working in Phnom Penh or whatever, but they sort of appear nicely dressed and carrying offerings, and when they're outside of their own environments, I think these are people who are temporarily or for a number of months are in Phnom Penh, but when they're outside of their own environments, the museum can become a place where, and more it has become a place, the National Museum, right next to the palace, built by the French, the whole thing. The National Museum has become more and more of a place of a sort of expression, not only of state order through restitution, but also of something that is short of the state. It underpins the state, but it's short of the state. And I think those practices are something to really look at, appreciate, and figure out ways of working with during and after restitution processes to shift modes of interpretation. So, yeah. Thanks, Lawrence.
On behalf of Lawrence, thank you. And that is all the time we have today for questions. We hope that you'll join us for more conversation in a light reception just outside these doors. But before we adjourn, please join me in thanking Professor Ashley Thompson one last time.